We have been working through Matthew's gospel for a year and a half or so, and we are in Matthew 16, so we're at the halfway point here. We're going to make it through. We are going to skip the first 4 verses in Matthew chapter 16. That's the passage where the Pharisees and the Sadducees come and ask Jesus for a sign, and he says, no sign will be given except for the sign of the prophet Jonah. And the reason that we're skipping it now is because there was a nearly identical incident in Matthew chapter 12 that we worked through on September 22nd, 2024. So if you want to go back and listen to that, you're welcome to do that. But it is important to note here that this context is that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which are 2 different kinds of religious leaders, are asking Jesus for a sign to prove himself, to prove who he is. Now, this is despite the fact that Jesus has been multiplying loaves and fishes. He just did the feeding of the 5,000. Then he did the feeding of the 4,000. He's been healing both in Jewish territory and Gentile territory. He's been doing all kinds of miracles. His words are true, and they're resonating as true with people who are hearing him. But these religious leaders want a sign of their choosing. They want to determine what that sign will be. They want Jesus to jump through their hoops. They have this idea that they are the standard, and Jesus must meet that standard. So that's where we pick up Matthew 16, starting in verse 5. It says, when the disciples reached the other side, so they're going across the sea here, they had forgotten to bring any bread. Jesus said to them, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, we brought no bread. But Jesus, aware of this, said, oh, you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So at first reading, some of the details in here can make it a little bit hard for us to understand what Jesus is getting at. And so we'll walk through this piece by piece and layer by layer, and we'll try to answer first what this whole bread thing is all about and the numbers and the baskets full. And then we'll try to get to the big thing Jesus is warning us about here, because he tells us to beware of something very specific that we do need to beware of. So tracing out the conversation here, Jesus and his disciples, they cross the Sea of Galilee, and when they get to the other side, the disciples say, we forgot to pack a lunch. We did not bring any food for this trip at all. We came on this long trip, we're tired, we're hungry, but we have no food. Jesus knows they're hungry, and he uses their hunger as an opportunity to teach them something about spiritual hunger, but they don't know right away that's what he's doing. And so Jesus says, well, watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So the disciples here are thinking that Jesus is still talking about the food that they don't have. So they say, we don't have bread. And Jesus says, well, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And leaven was what you made bread out of. It was a little chunk of last week's dough that you worked into this week's dough so that it would rise and so that bread could be baked. And so they think this whole thing is all just about bread, but Jesus is trying to get at a deeper meaning here. He's got a different thing that he's trying to teach them. And so he says, after they say, we have no bread, he says, well, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they start talking to each other again in verse 7, and they're like, all right, we're hungry. We don't have any bread. We want something to eat. And now Jesus is telling us not to eat any of that leaven from the Pharisees and Sadducees. I mean, did you guys bring leaven from them? Like, did you guys have like Pharisee bread or something, someone sneaking a lunch that we don't know about? Like, what is this? And they finally come to this conclusion in verse 7, nobody brought any bread. So Jesus says, don't eat the Pharisee bread. And they say, well, nobody has any. We don't have any bread here at all. And so then in verse 8, Jesus clarifies. It says, Jesus, aware of this, said, oh, you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? And then he says something weird. He says, do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So Jesus says, guys, I'm not talking about bread here. I'm telling you to beware of something else. And the key to knowing what he's telling them to beware of, he says, is to remember how many baskets full of leftover bread there were, both when he did the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. So what's that? Well, just taking it bite by bite. Again, verse 9, he says, do you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? And so if you want to go back into Matthew 14, you can read the story. 5,000 people are there. They take loaves and fish and they multiply them to feed all of those people. And then when they're done and they're cleaning up, at the end of that whole thing, in Matthew 14, verse 20, there are 12 baskets full left over. And that whole miracle was done in Jewish territory. Then Jesus goes into Gentile territory, essentially to repeat the miracle. And so verse 10, he says, are the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? So he then goes into Gentile territory, same thing. They multiply the loaves, they multiply the fish, and then when they're cleaning up after all of the Gentiles eating all of the miraculous bread that was made, at the very end, there are 7 baskets full that are left over, according to Matthew 15:37. And he says, knowing about there being 12 baskets full and 7 baskets full is key to our understanding what he's talking about in this whole passage. Now, usually, you don't want to look at the numbers of the Bible to find secret spiritual meanings. There's like a whole field of biblical numerology, and a lot of it kind of is out to lunch, where you assign numerical values to sometimes each letter in the Hebrew alphabet, because they do have some numerical value, but then you add up like every third letter and the sums of those letters, and you can come up with the secret coded message that's been sent to us through Scripture. And the problem with that is no 2 people would ever reproduce the exact same meaning that they got from a technique like that, because there's no reason to read something like that. And normally we want to read words as words and read the numbers as numbers, not as like a secret code that God is using to communicate. The Scripture was given to us to reveal God to us, not to encode some things and hide things in ways like that. But in this case, Jesus says that the number of baskets of leftovers in each case, the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, is significant. He says that there is a message behind that. And I think that message would have been much clearer to his disciples than it is to us. And so first they go into Jewish territory, they feed the 5,000, and afterwards there are 12 baskets full left over. And that number 12 would have been really significant to the Jews because there were 12 tribes in Israel. They were divided into 12. And so at the end, when they've got all these baskets full that they're cleaning up and it's all overflowing with bread, there are 12 of them. So it's almost like Jesus is saying that he is the bread of life for all of the Jewish people, that he's more than enough for any of them that would believe. There's some for everybody among all the Jewish people. Then he goes into Gentile territory, he feeds the 4,000, and this time there are 7 baskets full left over, which doesn't sound super significant to us, but to the Jews, they knew that in the Old Testament, again and again, it was talked about like there were 7 major pagan nations, 7 Gentile nations. And you see it in verses like Deuteronomy 7:1. It says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mighty than you, and then he goes on from there. And so again and again, you'll see these 7 nations talked about in the Old Testament as the 7 pagan nations. And so Jesus goes into their territory, multiplies the loaves, and there are 7 baskets full left over, saying that Jesus is the bread of life for all the Gentiles. Whoever would believe in him, there's plenty, it's overflowing. Jesus is enough, and he's enough for them too. In Jesus, there is bread for the Jews. In Jesus, there is bread for the nations. This is part of the message that was being driven home, like when the Canaanite woman came to Jesus asking for a miracle, and she described it as allowing her to have some of the bread that falls from the table, that there was going to be enough for everybody. Jesus is food for all. Jesus is offered to all. And he would later command us as his disciples to go and preach the gospel to all nations because he is bread enough for the world. Jesus is the one that everyone needs. Jesus is enough for all. And so that's the meaning in the dual feeding miracles. And that's the meaning of these strange verses where Jesus is talking about how many baskets full are left over. And the big application he gives us, again, verse 11, is, how is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So Jesus is the true bread of life for everybody, and he gives a warning here to spiritually hungry people not to turn to the leaven or the bread of the Pharisees and Sadducees as an alternative to the true bread of life. And we don't have to wonder what the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees is because it says in verse 12 that it is their teaching. So he says that we're supposed to be aware of a certain kind of teaching or doctrine. And so this means that learning doctrine matters. And this is affirmed. This is what Paul says in 1 Timothy 4:16. Keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching or the doctrine. Persist in this, for by so doing you will save both yourself and your hearers. And that word doctrine for some people can carry some baggage. And depending on where you've been in church circles, there are kind of some different extremes that people will run to when they think about doctrine. You know, on the one hand, there are people who care very much about doctrine, but somehow they've made doctrine into an academic pursuit only, where they're really meticulous, they're careful to have the right beliefs, they're quick to sniff out errors, they know what they believe, they know how it all fits together in a system, they love to learn, they grasp the terms, they pick up the theological vernacular, but for some reason it seems to go unapplied. It doesn't make that journey from their head to their heart. It's not accompanied by affections for God and affections for other people around them. They learn some doctrine, but they kind of get this sense that it sets them against other people. And they don't move toward those in need in love, but they back away and use their doctrine to kind of stay aloof from everybody else. They can become very arrogant and look down on everyone else who doesn't parse the doctrinal minutia the same way they do. It can make other people mainly enemies as opposed to mainly people that they're supposed to love. And to be honest, this has been a bit of an issue here. I think we're known as a pretty good church to go to if you want to learn doctrine and have relatively rich content as we're taught from the Word of God. And that's by design, that's by conviction. We think that that's good. But we've also noticed that there is a tendency, just in some, to learn and then immediately feel superior to and divide from the people who only know as much as they knew 6 months ago. We can tend to have this knowledge is enough mindset where we work on our thoughts about Christ like we should do, but then we completely neglect stoking our affections for Christ. And anytime you're low in affections for Christ, you're also going to be low in affections for people around you. We can sometimes be really quick to make those around us feel like they're lesser Christians because they haven't learned the theological vernacular yet. We can be quick to kind of flex our knowledge, but we never really flex our love and grace muscles. We can start to become everything but loving and gracious. We can have heads that are very, very full, but then hearts that grow cold in affection for Christ and his people, which according to our doctrine is a problem because Jesus said the greatest commandments are to love God and to love people. And then we've even seen, and this is a much smaller pocket, but in extreme cases, this can get even darker, where that arrogance and building an image around being smarter about doctrine is accompanied by a really dark shadow side. And again, it's not a ton of people, but certainly there's been a handful of very knowledgeable yet arrogant guys who come along with a head full of knowledge, but then are cruel to their wives and their kids. They can't maintain Christian relationships. They kind of love the image of a knowledgeable Christian, but that outside image is everything, while love, even for those closest to them, doesn't seem to matter. We can become lopsidedly cerebral. And we can get our learning from even good sources on YouTube, but then neglect the fact that God has put us in a church. And it's not only so that we can learn knowledge, it's also so that we can have community with others, so we can be around other wise Christians, so that we can struggle together, so that we can struggle with each other, so we can take these things about Jesus and remind people of them sometimes at their lowest moments. So we can have a context where there's relationship and there's service, and then we can be learning, but also be being humbled by our interactions with other people. And sometimes we need to be grounded like that, where we can get up and just wax eloquently about some area of doctrine, but we need the more grounded, older Christian to come alongside us and say, hey, that's nice. Could you come help me figure out why there's that weird sewage smell down in the cafe? Or will you come sit with me next to this person who's dying in the hospital so that we can share with them Jesus in their final moments? Because if we're learning tons of theology and it's only going to our heads and we're becoming more arrogant, more unkind, more impatient, more divisive, more fault-finding and nitpicky, more quick to criticize, more looking for a fight, more demeaning to spouses, if that's what's happening, we're doing it wrong. Because when we do theology right, it goes to our hearts and our hands. We're not doing it right if it's making us less loving and gracious. Theology is like one of those subjects where you can get an A on the written test, but then really flunk the class because it isn't going to the heart. It isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. And we don't want that to be our church. We don't want our church or our groups or our classes to be environments where people are ashamed to not know things yet. Where they look around and it's like, all these people seem so smart because of the words they're using. They all just talk like they assume that everybody understands all these things that they're talking about. And if we're always like that, we're not being loving to the people who are just a little bit behind us. It's like we're climbing a 100-foot ladder and breaking off every rung after we've used it. So then someone else comes along behind us and they just don't even have a rung to get to because we're so far above them. So we have to be careful of that extreme. And then what's happened is some church leaders in some places have looked at that kind of coldness that they see in some of those more doctrinaire people. They've seen that lack of love, the arrogance, and the divisions, and they've said, well, forget about doctrine. I mean, it only divides. What matters is passionate worship. What matters is how you live your life. Christianity is about relationship with Jesus and serving people. It's not about facts from a book. So throw out the pursuit of right doctrine. Don't worry about potentially serious doctrinal errors. But Jesus actually tells us here to beware of the doctrine of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But some people will identify that real problem in the cold doctrine-y people, and they'll remedy it with a false solution that says, don't examine your doctrine, when 1 Timothy 4:16 says to keep a close watch on it, and when Jesus says to beware and to watch out for false doctrine. So head and heart both matter in pursuit of Jesus. We really have to have both. I mean, imagine that you're a firefighter and you spend all of your time in the fire hall studying. You're studying maps of the city, you're studying hose water pressure, you're studying rescue techniques because you're trying to learn all the facts, and then all of a sudden you get a call that there's a fire. And this is kind of an interruption. This is not what you want to be doing. You want to be studying, you want to be learning about these things, so you just kind of reluctantly and slowly slide down the pole, you drive that fire engine to the place where the fire is. You see the smoke, you know which building's on fire because you've got these maps memorized, you know what's going on here. And so you half-heartedly put the ladder up against the building, you climb it slowly, you shouldn't have to be doing this. You rescue some people from the building, but you're going so slowly that because of your total lack of heart, some people end up being hurt. We know that's a bad firefighter who's all facts without the heart. If firefighting is all in your head and it's not accompanied by passion and real action, people will be hurt. But imagine you're a firefighter and you're all passion. And you get the call that there is a fire on the 12th floor of an apartment building. So you slide down that pole fast, you're pumped, you're ready to go, you turn on the lights and sirens. Now, you don't exactly know where you're going, so you take a couple of wrong turns while you're getting there, but eventually you get there. There's all kinds of smoke when you get there, and you're not exactly sure which building is which. So you throw the ladder up against one, you run up, you break the window. One by one, you're rescuing people. You're going fast. You're getting people down that ladder twice as fast as that other guy. And then after you've done that for about 20 minutes, you look up and you realize, oh, that whole time the ladder was up against the wrong building. So here's the firefighter who's got firefighting all in his heart, but his head wasn't engaged. And people are hurt by that kind too. And so doctrine without action and passion is a problem, but passion and action without doctrine is also a really big problem. We don't want to be the cold people whose doctrine doesn't go to the heart, and we don't want to be sincere and passionate people who end up finding out that they were worshiping the wrong God because they don't want to learn any theology. So Paul says, keep a close watch on both yourself and on the teaching you believe. Your life matters and your doctrine matters. Your heart matters and your head matters. You don't have to choose. In fact, you shouldn't choose. So when Jesus tells us here to beware of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees, he's just reaffirming this fact that doctrine matters. There's right and wrong teaching, and we should be people who study and learn what's true. But what doctrine specifically are we being warned about? What is the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees? What is it that they're teaching that we should avoid? And one of the things that makes that difficult to answer is that the Pharisees and Sadducees, though they're often grouped together when they're described in the New Testament, they were not the same kind of people. In fact, Pharisee doctrine and Sadducee doctrine was very, very different. They had different roles in society, and they believed some very different things. The Pharisees were the synagogue leaders, so they would have been the equivalent much more of like local church pastors. Whereas the Sadducees were a wealthy elite group that controlled the temple, the one central temple in Jerusalem. They controlled the Jewish governing council, the Sanhedrin. And so the Pharisees were more of like the popular local shepherds, where the Sadducees were the religious elite. The Pharisees were more what we would consider to be middle class. The Sadducees were upper class. The Pharisees believed in the oral tradition, the tradition of the elders, in addition to the Old Testament. The Sadducees only accepted the written word in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The Pharisees believed in the afterlife. They believed that the dead would resurrect someday. They believed in angels and demons. And the Sadducees didn't believe in any of that. Sadducees didn't believe in an afterlife. There were no angels, no demons. It was, in some ways, it would have looked like a very different religion between these two groups. And these two groups, the Pharisees and Sadducees, normally did not get along at all. So when Jesus says to beware of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees, it'd be easy to say like, well, what exactly should we beware of here? Because that's like everything. If I were to say beware of the political beliefs of the Republicans and Democrats, you'd say that's like all of the political beliefs. Like what are we supposed to beware of specifically? That's just way too broad of a category. I mean, these guys, the Pharisees and Sadducees, have nothing in common except for one big thing. They're all opposed to Jesus. They're hypocrites, so they have that in common. Jesus has said that. But in this passage here, they are together unified in their hatred for Jesus. Jesus' presence among these people has kind of made strange bedfellows of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They had their hypocrisy, and they also had that they didn't like Jesus at all, and they were together in those things. And so they come together demanding signs from Jesus, trying to make him submit to them and their requirements. And together, they're opposed to Jesus. Their leaven, their teaching is a false bread that many hungry people will turn to if they don't understand that Jesus is the true bread for all. And again, because Jesus uses the word leaven to describe their teaching and not just bread, this means that it's something that spreads and grows and makes something bigger. It can be popular, it can be huge. So we're being told here to beware of the teaching that offers an alternative to Jesus as the bread of life. And we need to be especially alert to it because it can be attractive, it can spread, and it can change everything, just like leaven does. And there are lots of different forms of teaching that can spread and be alternatives to the true Jesus, alternatives to the true bread. There are different ways that this leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees can manifest itself. And so 3 big categories of the anti-true bread teaching would be Jesus if teaching, Jesus plus teaching, and Jesus minus teaching. And I'll explain these, but you can see all of them in the Pharisees. Jesus, if teaching, says that, like the Pharisees and Sadducees said, that it says that I will accept Jesus if I determine that he's acceptable. I'll accept Jesus or I'll follow Jesus, I'll obey Jesus if what he says and does is what I've already decided he should say and do. So I have like a preconceived notion of what Jesus should be like, and if he checks those boxes, he jumps through my hoops, then I'll follow him and accept him. So I shop for a Jesus that says exactly what I want on every topic. And I say I will accept and I will follow Jesus if he says, for example, what I already think he should say about sexuality, what I already think he should say about my marriage, what I already think he should say about my lifestyle. what I already think he should say about my politics. If he says that I should interact with people I disagree with the way that I want to interact with people I disagree with, then I'll welcome him in. It's Jesus if teaching. We do this in all kinds of ways, and we do it across the political spectrum. A couple weeks ago, a purported Christian on Twitter tweeted, "If your pastor tells you on Sunday that we need to weep with those who weep, then you need to find a new church." But that's actually a direct quote of Jesus. Like, that wouldn't just be me telling you that because I had this crazy idea. Jesus said that in the Sermon on the Mount. And so here he is quoting Jesus and saying, if your pastor quotes Jesus on Sunday, you should find another church, because saying something like that doesn't really fit the vibe of today. We follow Jesus if what he says fits the vibe. And that's all the leaven of the scribes and the Pharisees who are saying Jesus if he gives us a sign. Another form of false teaching that's opposed to Jesus is Jesus plus teaching. It's the teaching that says that Jesus isn't enough, that he isn't enough to fill the baskets of the Jews and Gentiles. There has to be something else that we add. So examples of this would be where we say Jesus is not enough to save us. We must add our own works. It can't possibly be enough that Jesus died for us. I must have to contribute something. Just like the Pharisees were obsessed with ritual washings to make themselves feel like they were clean enough and feel like they were pure enough, we can often say it must be Jesus plus something else that I add in my life for me to actually be saved, because there's no way that what he did for me on that cross could possibly be enough. Or we'll say it must be Jesus plus something else that allows us to really grow and build the Christian life on. This is the error of the Galatians, who thought that having begun in the Spirit, they would now be perfected in the flesh. That you start out by believing, but then a bunch of stuff that you do makes you perfect. Or Jesus plus teaching can also be where we say you need Jesus plus something else to fully thrive as a Christian. That you need Jesus plus you got to be surrounded with enough people who share your beliefs and your politics. You need Jesus, but then once you're married, then you'll be able to really thrive as a Christian. We need Jesus, but then if we could fix circumstances, then Jesus plus that will be enough for us. But then there's also Jesus minus teaching that makes Jesus less than he is. These Pharisees and Sadducees, they thought that they were in a position to judge Jesus, which meant that they didn't believe that he was truly God. And so not believing that he's God, they thought that he would have to subject himself to their judgments. He would have to do whatever tricks they wanted so that they could evaluate him. They thought that they were the judge and he was the one who was being judged, because it was Jesus minus some really important things about who he is. And this is some of the teaching that's growing like leaven in some of the new media, where you have popular teachers, even really likable ones and valuable ones, like people like a Jordan Peterson, who have a high appreciation for Jesus as a supreme example and as an ultimate man, as a great example of what someone can be if he sets his mind on the highest good. But then he stops short of worshiping him as God, of saying that he is God. It's a smaller Jesus. It's Jesus minus his divinity. Jesus minus the necessity that we worship him. Jesus minus the call for us to know him personally. Jesus minus the belief that we should take every word from Jesus as the word of God to us. It's looking at the cross of Jesus only as an example of self-sacrifice, but that's less than it actually was. Because certainly it was an example of self-sacrifice, but it was the atoning death of the Son of God in the place of sinners like us, so that whoever would believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life. So whether we're saying that we need something more than Jesus to save us, whether we're saying Jesus is less than he claimed to be, or whether we're saying that we'll accept and follow and believe in Jesus if he tells us to do the things we want him to, those are all different forms of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so whether we're saying I'll follow Jesus if he meets my conditions, or that we have to add something to Jesus to be saved, or that whether we're subtracting from who he is, we're missing the message that those baskets were completely full with enough bread for everyone who would believe, whether Jew or Gentile. Jesus is the true bread of life. He's enough to save, and he is the one you can build your life on. So beware of any teaching that makes little of Jesus. Beware of any teaching that makes the message of Jesus' cross seem insignificant, or like it's not enough, or like it's incomplete, or like it's outdated, or like, yeah, that was a good thing to be talking about 10 years ago, but now we need more because we need to know the times that we're living in. Beware of any teaching that'll diminish that true relief that you once felt when you recognized that you were forgiven by Jesus. Beware of any teaching that makes light of the necessity that we have a relationship with him. Any teaching that says that you need more than the cross for your salvation, Jesus says beware of it. We can all stop. We can stop looking for something that's deeper. We can stop looking for something that's better. We can stop looking for something that's superior. Because there is nothing more. There's no greater treasure. There's no greater gift than the gospel. The message that Jesus Christ died for our sins, was buried, and rose again. It's the bread that we need. And he is enough.